How's it going, everybody? This is Martin Stokes here.
And this is Dean Scurry.
And I am a traveller.
And I'm a countryman.
Welcome to A Traveller
and a Countryman podcast. Episode 16, A Traveller and a Countryman podcast. And I think we're delighted to have Fr Peter McVerry in for the chat. And where this chat will go, I haven't got a clue. But I think it'll be a bit deeper than who are you and where you're from. You know, I think we all know who you are, Peter. I think we all know where you're from, and you've told your story about the first time you went into the North Inner City and you realised that this shit is real, like, and that over time led you into working in Ballymun in a tower block with young homeless men mainly. And that was probably 30 years ago when that journey started, and you were called the Hedge. And people like Rocky Smith and all that were hanging out with you, looking for a little bit of shelter, a little bit of comfort, a little bit of charity. And since then, you've gone on to lead the way in homeless support. You've got a huge organisation that bears your name, the Peter McVerry Trust, which on a day-to-day basis, you probably don't have an awful lot to do with anymore, as you've said, because when you pass on, that still needs to run. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to invite you just to say why come along and do this podcast? What's the purpose of doing these things? Because what's it going to change?
Well, change comes about very slowly and in small little segments. And for me, change always comes about, effective change always comes about from the bottom up, not from the top down. So I would see a large part of my work as informing people, ordinary people on the ground, about issues in Ireland, and about trying to motivate and inspire people to stand up, to maybe protest, to lobby for change. So, yeah, I see it as very important that we engage with ordinary people, raise awareness, and encourage people to act.
And what always intrigues me is why the need to do that? Why isn't the default mode charity?
Yeah, there's different perspectives on seeing things. At the moment, there is a movement to try and suggest to people that because of the energy crisis, they stop paying their energy bills. Now, to me, that misses the point that the vast majority of people out here in Ballymun are on prepay power.
Yeah.
You can't stop paying your energy bills. True. Or you're in darkness. So people see problems from different perspectives. If you take the Irish economy, for example, one way of looking at the Irish economy is that it is extraordinarily successful. We have a surplus of tax this year of 6.8 billion.
Yep.
We have the highest number of people in employment that we've ever had in our history. And that's the perspective that a Minister for Finance, Minister for Public Expenditure, a Minister for Employment, that's the perspective they have. But if you look at it from the other end, I often say, why would a young person in this country who has completed a third level qualification or an apprenticeship, why would they stay in this country?
Yeah.
They're never going to own a house. They're going to be paying astronomical rents for very insecure accommodation all their lives. They're living in a country with one of the highest cost of livings in the European Union. Why would you stay? And indeed, many people are not staying. They're going off as teachers, as nurses, as doctors. They're going off to Canada, Australia, the Middle East, where they can enjoy a much better lifestyle. So you look at the Irish economy from that perspective, and I would almost say Ireland is a failing state, if not a failed state, because the contract that Ireland made with young people was, you stay in education, you get a good leaving cert, work hard, get a good leaving cert, go on to third level or an apprenticeship, work hard, get your qualification, and then we, Ireland, will look after you. Now, young people have come to realise they can do all that, but Ireland is not looking after them.
Not looking after them.
It's got nothing to offer them. So, two very different perspectives on the Irish economy, and I think we could translate that into any other issue. We could translate it into the housing issue and any other issue in Irish society. So those who are in... one of the images I use is the view from the top and the view from the bottom. If you live in the top floor flat of a house and you look out the window in the morning into the back garden, and you see a lovely back garden, the grass nicely cut, the flowers swaying in the breeze, the birds jumping around the lawn, looking for worms, and the sun shining through the window, and you say, it's a wonderful day. But if you live in the basement flat of the same house, and you look out into the back garden at the same time of the same day, you don't see any garden. You just see the whitewashed wall of the outside toilet. And there you have two people looking at into the same garden at the same time of the same day, but they have two totally different views. And what's happening in Irish society is there are two totally different views. There are more than two, but to keep the analogy simple, there are two totally different views. There's a view from the top and a view from the bottom. If you're in a well-paid, pensionable, permanent job, and you're living in a nice house in a nice part of the city, and your children are going to third level education, you have a perspective on what's happening in Ireland, which is very, very positive. But if you live in a deprived neighbourhood full of drugs, your children are bored stiff in school, you have no hope of ever getting a decent job, you have a very, very different perspective on what's happening in Irish society. So how do we change that? We have to get the view from the bottom basement. We have to get that view heard, respected, which it isn't, and acted on. And the only way we can do that is by mobilising people who are in the basement, mobilising people who do not think Ireland is a great place to be, and mobilising them to seek to bring about change in whatever way they can, by lobbying, by protest, by marches, ensuring that their views are heard and that those who make the decisions are not exclusively looking at the view from the top flat.
Yeah, but who cares about those people on the bottom? You know, why care? Why care? The system is set up for a certain group of people. You know, you can do the division across class or whatever, the big elephant in the room in Ireland. We don't talk about bleeding class. But, you know, why give a rat's about these people?
Who cares? They do.
Yeah, but why does anybody else from a different perspective? If you're in the gutter, so what? You're in the gutter.
Right. The only way you can bring some of them will be motivated by a sense of justice and a sense of fairness. But the way you bring about change is to make life uncomfortable for those who do not want change. In other words, it has to be more beneficial to them to bring about the changes you want and to not bring about the changes you want. So mass protests on the street, we had that back in the 70s. We had a massive protest against tax. Tax took 1 million people out on the street. It brought about change.
And was there a tax amnesty then, or was that at that time, or they just they lowered? Because I remember my dad was paying something ridiculous like 65 pence in the pound, and then they had an amnesty. They
reformed the tax system. So I think what we have to do is to encourage people who are at the bottom of that society, who are neglected, who are ignored, whose interests and needs are not being met. You have to get them to mobilise, and you have to get
which is a hard task, because those are the people who are in survival mode.
That's right. You're living from day to day. You're trying to survive. It is very difficult, and therefore they need some support from people who are what we might call middle class. They do need that support.
Well, I'm going to poke a hole in that thing, Peter. So why isn't it like that? What is it? What is the motivating thing? Like we talked last week, me and Martin sat in here last week, and we talked about pride, shame, greed. Damien Dempsey's line, greed is the knife and the scars run deep. Is it just greed? Why it's not set, why the status quo isn't the way we're suggesting that it should be?
It's partly greed, but it's also largely blindness. I remember you mentioned I went into the inner city of Dublin in 1974. I went in to live in Summerhill. Two things shocked me. One was the conditions that people lived in. Much of the housing was old tenement buildings from the 1800s, divided into flats for families, no soundproofing between flats. In our flat, we could hear the news on the television in the flat below us perfectly clearly. The place was crawling with rats. The rats were the size of little kittens. And in some of those houses, there was one outside toilet for 8 families.
Sounds like a traveller site I was up in the other day.
Well, that absolutely shocked me. But what shocked me even more, I had been living in Dublin for the previous 10 or 15 years. And I knew about the inner city, but I was totally unaware.
Where were you living?
Of the conditions. Well, I was studying for the priesthood, and I was teaching in Belvedere College. But I was totally unaware of the conditions that people lived in. It was my ignorance, my blindness,
your perspective,
which shocked me most. And therefore, it was only when I went in and saw the conditions and lived in those conditions that I came to realise this is absolutely appalling and this must change. So I can understand that people are not aware of
what they're living in, basically,
of how other people are living.
I get it. I get to live behind a gated community in Portmarnock, and if I never been to Ballymun, I could tell you stories, and you wouldn't believe them. Yeah. But I have the privilege of perspective of being in both worlds on the same day. Yeah. But there's one of you, Peter. There's one of me. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Sorry,
we have to do our little bit. If you live out in Foxrock, and you work in Ballsbridge and you shop in Grafton Street, you will never, ever encounter a poor person.
That's right.
Or a hungry person. You will never. So it's a totally different world, and you're oblivious of that world. You may encounter it from time to time. You may see a homeless person on the street begging, but you're oblivious basically to that world. And even when you do encounter it, you interpret it differently. You interpret it. This homeless person is a loser. This homeless person is a dropout. This homeless person is a drug user. It's his own fault or her own fault. They started using drugs. So why should we have any sympathy? So unless you, what I say, make friends with people who are poor, make friends with people who are on the margins. That's the key to change. That's the key to growing your awareness of what is happening in our society.
And that kind of explains the embryo of this podcast, Peter. You know what I mean? Because I live in Ballymun. I used to play around with travellers when I was a kid, and then I was given a narrative that they're not to be played with. You know what I mean? Yeah. Based on Charlie's Hotty's anti-traveller acts or whatever, you know? But recently, in the last 4 or 5 years, I've realised that these people are in my community. And they're living in poverty. They're living, a lot of them, in conditions that you described there in Summerhill 30 years ago. And I made it my business to go and find out who these people are and befriend them. And Martin's my friend now. He's not just some traveller I do a podcast with. He's my mate. And my perspective has changed. And through this podcast, other people's perspectives are changed. They're being offered the opportunity to see it from a different angle.
Yep. And that's what's important. And it's not just an academic sort of understanding of how other people live. It's actually befriending some people who are struggling, befriending some people who are poor, befriending some people who are homeless or who are using drugs. It's the befriending, because then the way they see things and the way they experience things slowly becomes the way you see things and you experience things. One of the big issues I'm very strongly about is drugs. Drugs is you take here in Ballymun, drugs is pervasive and it is destroying whole families. It is destroying parts of the community. Crack cocaine is the drug of choice now, and it is absolutely horrendous.
It's great business, though.
Great business. But if you're a politician, you're not living in an area where this is going on.
Not crack, but you live in an area where there's a lot of cocaine if you're a politician.
You might know a lot of middle class people who are using cocaine, but that's not the problem. They're using cocaine, but they're not out robbing to feed their drug habit. They're not threatening families who owe money for.
They're probably increasing the rent on the properties that they own and doing sweetheart deals and brown envelope deals. So they are robbing. It's just not in the Ballymun on the street way of robbing.
Yeah, so one of my criticisms is, if we need a huge increase in the number of drug treatment centres available, many parts of the country, there's no drug treatment centre available. I know somebody who's in Balbriggan at the moment. He has to come up to Dublin every day to collect his methadone.
Peter, it was only about 15 years ago when politicians said we don't have a drug problem in this country.
Yeah.
Are you joking me? Like on national TV, politicians who earn 70, 80, 100 grand a year going, there's no drug problem.
They live in an area where there is no drug problem.
They live in a fucking bubble.
They live in an area where there may be drug use, but it's not a drug problem. Middle class people using cocaine, it may be a problem to themselves, but they're not a problem to the community.
Yeah.
And so they're living in an area where drug use is not a problem to the community, and they're oblivious of the need for a... However, it's, 70 to 80% of those who go into prison have an addiction. Going into prison.
70 to 80% of those who go to prison are from working class areas.
Oh, absolutely. But they also have an addiction. And it is in society's interest to try and address that addiction by expanding the number of treatment centres that are available. Somebody goes into prison with an addiction. They get very little help in prison for their addiction. They come out again with an addiction. They're back into robbing to feed their drug habit. They're back into causing havoc for families, for households that they rob or that they threaten because their money is owed to them. From where I see things, I think it is absolute priority that we invest a lot of money in drug treatment services, and I think that would make a huge difference to the quality of life of many people in areas like Ballymun. In the 1974 Misuse of Drugs Act, some far-sighted civil servant put in a section which allowed judges to send people whose crimes were non-violent but linked to their addiction, to send them to a custodial drug treatment centre. That's 50 years ago now. We still don't have a custodial drug treatment centre.
Peter, it's 2022. It's only last week that the guards and the people who run Electric Picnic have agreed we'll test the tablets that the kids are putting down their necks. We'll take them off them, we won't give them back, but we'll test them. You know what I mean? That's where we are in terms of our drug policy. It's like fingers in the ears, hands over the eyes, see no evil, hear no evil, la 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 la. And unfortunately, we in Ballymun and Finglas in Darndale and Coolock, we don't live in La La Land.
Yeah.
We live in bleeding reality.
Well, with the Electric Picnic, there was an agreement that the guards would not stop anybody going to this site where they test drugs, nor would they be on the site, or nor would they arrest people who are bringing tablets to the site to be tested. So I think it was a very positive step. Very positive step, and it's been that way for a number of years. It wasn't just this year, but
I think this year they made a big announcement of it, and they also people going in thought, I can get me drugs tested and they'll give them back to me, and then they realised very quickly.
Well, what you do, you bring in 6 or 8 tablets.
Yeah, you give them one.
You give one.
Very good. If you want drug advice, how to get your drugs into Electric Picnic, Peter McVerry has it. Brian, I'm going to bring you in because I know you were really interested and excited about having Peter come in today.
Yeah, I was just wondering, going back to where you said about you were living in the town and in the tenement buildings, and how all literally the poverty was in them, like. That's going back 30 years now, is it? 40 years, is it?
40 years.
40 years. So you were only a young lad
74. I went into those buildings 74. What's that? Almost 50 years ago now.
The year after I was born.
50 years ago.
And those conditions continued up to 1980. It was only 1980 that they demolished the Summerhill, the Sean McDermott Street, the Gardner Street, the Foley Street.
The tenements.
Yeah. And interestingly, Those were very visible tenements. Dublin City Council tenements, very visible. They demolished them all. But the tenements haven't gone away. The tenements are now to be found in the private rented sector. Yes. And they're invisible. You walk down a road, you see a lovely house, lovely front door, 8 doorbells beside the front door. You don't know what's behind that. And some of the apartments I've been in are absolutely horrendous.
You go down North Circular
just
Street
as bad.
and it's just like that. North Circular Street, or North Circular Road, all the way to the park.
Yeah,
it's all like that.
It's all flats.
It's all flats.
Many of them are lovely.
And we've all known the stories of 10 Brazilians in a bleeding bunking up in one room.
Well, many of the flats would be lovely. I mean, very suitable to live in. But the problem is you just don't know. You don't see them. And so the tenements today exist, but they are invisible.
What do you mean? You don't see it?
That's even more dangerous than visible tenements, because visible tenements can generate an anger and a desire to get rid of them. Invisible tenements can't generate anything.
They're all hidden behind landlords and bells, and you just can't get in and have a look around, and there's not much way to regulate that kind of market,
And you can't complain. If you're in one of these appalling, I've been in them with exposed electric wires, mould on the windows, no heating work that's adequately working. You can't complain. Because if you complain, the fear is the landlord will throw you out and you become homeless. You can't even complain sometimes to the Residential Tenancies Board, because if the apartment you're living in is under an estate agent, you have to bring a complaint to the Residential Tenancies Board against the landlord, and you have to provide them with the landlord's name and address. But if you're dealing with an estate agent,
you don't know the landlord.
The estate agent doesn't have to give you the landlord's name and address, nor does they have to give it to the Residential Tenancies Board. There's nothing the Residential Tenancies Board can do.
So is there nothing that the government can do about it? No.
Well, they're supposed to inspect.
They're
supposed to inspect all private rented accommodation.
Yes.
And in fairness to Dublin City Council, they do inspect a good proportion of them.
Yeah.
Many local authorities don't inspect any or very few. They say that if they find it unsuitable, they'll tell the landlord, here's a list of things that you have to do. They don't want to close down those unsuitable private rented accommodation, because then the people become homeless and come back onto the local authority homeless list again, adding to the numbers. So they're very reluctant to close down.
That's still putting people's lives in danger all the same, isn't it? If they're making the decision not to close a place down, like for instance, if you go into a restaurant, and it's not up to state they should be, like we say, health-wise, they'll close that restaurant down, won't they?
Yeah.
So whoever, obviously the owner, whoever he is, he goes home to his home, whatever. It's not like they're putting tenants out of this restaurant. There might be people working in them, all right. Same thing if you're driving a car, and you have no NCT or no tax on this car. This car is not roadworthy then. So they'll seize that car, the Gardaí will, rightly so. If you're in one of these buildings that we're talking about, and there's maybe 2 or 3 floors and 5 or 6 different people living in them, and they're not in a state of, let's say, humanitarian state, if you want to put it that way, or they're not in a state of safety yet, where they're damaging people's health or could be even more dangerous. Can councils or governments not come in and say, okay, right, we're going to talk to the landlord, we're seizing this building here until you have everything right in it?
Can't seize the building. That's against the right to private property, which is in the Constitution. All they can do...
But is it not a case where it should be allowed to do it?
All they can do is give the landlord a list of improvements that the landlord has to implement.
If the landlord doesn't do anything with this building, and there's electric wires coming down, and there's water leaking, and there's mould and dampness in the corners, and the floors are damaged, or they could go down through them.
If it's very bad, you can close down the
building until the landlord gets it right.
On health and safety issues.
What Peter's saying is the catch-22 is all of a sudden 20 people are homeless then.
That's right. Yeah.
And so homeless is used as a bit of a stick. If you complain, you'll be homeless. And then also it's also used as a way of not following up on stuff, going, I don't want to be the boogeyman here and put these 20 people on the streets.
But we're talking now about a small number of what I call rogue landlords. The vast majority of landlords provide a very, very good quality accommodation.
And there's always going to be chancers and people who just don't give a rat's. And, Donald Trump made his bleeding millions on it.
Unfortunately, I'm working with homeless people and people who are, what we might say, at the bottom end of society. They tend to be the ones who rogue landlords will give accommodation to, because they're desperate.
They're easy to manipulate
if
as well.
you're in a job and you see a landlord offers you accommodation and it's in very poor condition, you just say no. But if you're homeless and you're desperate for somewhere, you don't say no. You say, well, it's better than the streets, even though it's not much better than the streets. So people I work with tend to encounter these rogue landlords perhaps more frequently than the general population would.
And what you've done in the last couple of years with what's called housing forced is you're technically becoming the landlord. Is that correct?
Yeah, we have about 500-600 apartments. We are landlords for the people there. They're all homeless people. They're accommodation for homeless people. Some of them, Housing First is accommodation for homeless people with serious personal issues like addiction or mental health. We will provide them with accommodation. We tell them this accommodation is yours for life. You never ever have to leave it. You can have it for as long as you like, and we will provide you with the supports that you need. Only two conditions.
If and when you're ready. Sorry, go on.
Only two conditions. One, you pay your rent, which is no problem because it's usually deducted from your social welfare at source.
Yeah.
And the other is that you don't mess up for the neighbours. If you
Yeah.
mess up for the neighbours, we'll put you out, but we'll try and find you somewhere else with less neighbours. We provide. We become.
So is that
become
working?
the
Because I would have been critical of
Yeah.
your version of housing forced a couple of years ago, but it looks like from the outside that it's starting to actually operate.
Oh yeah, it's very successful.
Because I
might get 10% who mess up the apartment, and you have to put them out. We will never put them out on the street. We will offer them something, an alternative. It may be a hostel for a while, or it may be another apartment somewhere else. We will never put anybody on the street. That's not that's not what we're in the business of doing. So we will, but at 90%, retain their accommodation for years.
And I think for me the concept of housing forced is you're in a shit situation, we're going to give you housing forced. Yeah. And then we can look at the other stuff down the line if and when you're ready. But it used to be like in this country, get everything sorted out and then come back to us and we might get you accommodation. Right. So a lot of, it's kind of been reversed. So I've seen that model, probably the most effective version of that is in Finland with the Y Foundation. And like they now have €1 billion asset and they're turning part of it into a cooperative where the people who pay the rent can also work for the Y Foundation and they own part of the asset. Yeah. Which I just think, and I know Finland's a bleeding socialist utopia, but I think it's a really interesting way to go.
Yeah, Finland is the model. It has eliminated homelessness virtually.
Virtually, yeah. Street homelessness is almost gone.
Yeah, that's right. It is the model, and they... Three things I think have made it the model. One, they invested heavily in social housing. So they did have apartments they could offer to homeless people. But I think a second factor was the people who made decisions in relation to homelessness and housing, they stayed in their jobs for years. And so they developed an expertise and a passion for the job. Here you have a Minister for Housing who may be in the job for 6 months, a year, 2 years. Then he moves on to education and some other person comes in as Minister for Housing, has to learn the job, maybe hasn't got much interest in the job perhaps.
And he might be psychologically adverse to creating an asset that homeless people own as a cooperative.
The second thing that Finland has is that the people who make the decision stay in the job for a long time. And the third thing, there is huge coordination between services. You need coordination between housing services, the addiction services, the mental health services. You need coordination between these services, and that doesn't happen. Everybody's in their own silo doing their own thing.
I'm going to beg to differ for a second because it did happen for 12 months during the corona with Austin, with Dr. Austin O'Carroll.
Yeah.
he pulled it together and he showed we can do this, lads. Sorry, I remember being in the Y Foundation and I said to him, "Where do you get your money from?" And he said, "See those one-armed bandits in all the shops all over Finland? We get all that money, and then we grab all that money, put it together, and then we use the asset and that money to go to the central bank of different countries and get less than 0% loans from them." So we run this as a business, but it's a cooperative business model. Yeah. It's stunning. Like I was nearly crying my eyes out listening to how simple it was.
We have no imagination here. Nobody's thinking outside the box. Nobody has any creativity. I mean, you look at the housing situation over the last 15 years. They know there's a housing crisis. What do? They try to tweak it. We'll reduce the size of apartments so you can build more apartments on the site. We'll reduce the number of car park spaces. We'll reduce the double. Each apartment has to have windows facing two sides. We'll reduce that to one side. They've been tweaking the system, and tweaking the system doesn't work.
And is that a profit greed thing? I'm just going back to greed again because I think it's an interesting concept to have in a country.
Well, I'm sure the developers and the builders did put a lot of pressure on the minister at the time to do that, because if you can put more apartments onto the same land space, then obviously you're going to make more money. So Minister of Housing probably hadn't a clue. And anyway, you know, the minister may be good friends with the builder or the developer.
What are you suggesting, Peter McVerry?
Well, we've seen, I'm not suggesting anything, but we have seen in the past.
Let's suggest the way.
We have seen in the past brown paper envelopes were passing at a great rate. Now, that's not happening today. I don't think it could happen today. I think it would be exposed very quickly. But there is an affinity, somebody who's in a professional job, which a minister is, tends to be more understanding of other people in a professional job like builders or developers.
But there's also conflicts of interest, which we had recently. You know, we had a minister resign because of a conflict of interest, because I own properties and I don't declare them. And I'm a minister for state. And I'm sure the minister for housing is a landlord of probably 40-50% of our TDs are landlords.
Well, it's smaller than that, as far as we know. Anyway.
As far as we know, as far as what's declared.
Yeah, it's maybe around 25-30%.
But there's an obvious conflict of interest.
Yeah, but there'll always be conflicts of interest.
Absolutely.
So long as that's why it's important for them to register their interests, so that the public can see that there may be a conflict of interest and can use that to ensure that that conflict does not result in adverse decisions.
But just like in the tenancy board, there's ways around it. There's different ways to skin a cat. There's different ways to fill a form
How
in.
many, say, homes have they built in the last 10 years in Ireland, in Dublin?
What type of homes? Well, private homes, and there's social and affordable homes.
Well,
there's public homes.
Apartments, houses.
We've been building on average about 20,000 houses every year.
Every year.
Now, all the experts say that we need to be building 35,000 just to keep up with the increase in population. Nothing to do with homelessness or anything, but just to keep up. So we're failing on that. But how many social houses have we built? Well, in this country in 1975, this country built 8,500 council houses.
Are they called public houses or social houses?
The government have tried to change the terminology.
That's why I'm being
I use council houses because that's very clearly houses built by the local authority and managed by the local authority. So in 1975, they built 8,500 council houses. In 1985, they built 6,900 council houses. And we had a recession in the 80s, so we weren't flush with money. And in 2015, this country built 75 council houses.
That's deadly.
That's the nub of the problem. The government have abdicated their responsibility for housing low-income families and households and transferred that responsibility to the private rented sector by giving a subsidy to the low-income household to pay the rent. And that's been a disaster.
What's the motivation for that from their perspective?
It was an ideology. It's a neoliberal ideology which believes that the private sector can bring in competition. Competition can make the private sector cheaper to provide goods and services, and more effective and more efficient at providing goods and services.
The market
And
will resolve the
Now,
issue.
it works fine, I presume, for motorways, but not for providing the basic needs. The private sector is in the business of profit. That's their raison d'etre. They want to make profit. They want to maximize the profit for their shareholders. And if they're in the business of housing, they will provide housing at the top end of the market, expensive housing and expensive rental accommodation. If you have €1 million to buy a house, you have a big choice out there. No problem. You can choose from a wide variety of houses. If you have 3,000 or 4,000 a month to spend on rent, you have a big choice out there. So the government keeps saying the problem is lack of supply. It's not lack of supply, it's a lack of affordable supply is the problem. And affordable supply will not be met by the market, it has to be met by the state.
So if the government knows then, right, there's so many people, right, at the moment there's families literally all over the country in hostels or hotel rooms, some of them with 2 and 3 and 4 children, and maybe probably can't go to work because they're stuck in hostels, maybe can't even get a job for that reason also. And the government know all about this, and yet they have no problem selling up land or even these these lovely apartments that they're building, that could house a lot of people that's in the homeless, say hostels, for instance, right? And yet they go ahead and just decide, look, we'll sell them to the private landlords, we call it, so they can rent them out to people that have good jobs that can afford this rent every month. But they're not. Obviously, it's making the problem worse for the people who can't afford this.
Right.
And it continues to say that the people are still in hostels because of that reason. So if the government was really, really worried about what's going on in their own country, and they don't want this country to completely collapse in the future, which it probably will do, and get worse and worse and worse, why can't they not just take a step back and say, hold it for 1 second, we can't afford to be selling these properties and these lands to private sectors coming from all over the world into our country and taking up our spaces, with all due respect, taking up our spaces that we need here for our own people to live in, because we're pushing our own people and our own country back into poverty over and over and over and deeper and deeper and deeper if we don't make a stand and say, hold it for 1 second, we need this for our people. We can't afford to sell them to other countries.
Yeah, that's. I think the government are coming around to realising that. They have committed to building 9,000 council houses this year and every year. Now, they're not going to meet that target by a long shot. In the first quarter of this year, they built less than 700 council houses. They'll probably end up at the end of the year with maybe 4,000, 5,000 council houses, but still well short of the target. But they have that commitment. They realise that what they have been doing for the last 15 years has been a mistake. They've brought in these they've allowed these big international investment funds to come in. They now own tens of thousands of properties in Ireland, which they're renting out at very high rents. They don't actually even pay any tax on that rental income.
They didn't only allow them in, they invited them in.
They invited them with enormous tax concessions.
So it's business as usual. It's neoliberal Thatcher Reagan business.
That's
it's
what it has been.
privatise everything.
That's what it has been.
And what we need in this country is a shift of perspective, because there's people literally living in shacks, in shitholes, in gutters. And what I'm interested in is, and I done this at the weekend at Electric Picnic actually, is could we enshrine housing as a human right in our constitution like we have other stuff, and put it down as a absolute basic. We don't have that in this country. We're 100 years old this year, and we don't have the in our constitution anything got to do with housing as a human right.
Yeah, I'm very keen getting housing as into the constitution, the right to housing into the constitution. I think there's a whole lot of reasons for that. One, we have the right to education in the constitution. And as a result of that, every young person in this country is entitled to an education. And
free education?
Entitled to an education anyway.
Yeah, sorry, go on.
And if they're not getting the education, they can go to the High Court. The High Court will order the government to provide them with an education. If we could get the right to housing into the Constitution, it doesn't mean the day after the referendum every homeless person can demand the keys of a house. Of course not. That's not practical. No. But it does give housing a priority for government over everything else, except education. Gives it a priority, and it imposes on them an obligation to provide policies and a timeline, maybe by 2030, at the end of which everybody in this country is entitled to a home. So I'd be very keen to get it. The other reason for getting it in is an expression of our values. If we don't put that into the Constitution, what we're saying is, well, housing isn't really that important. And yet housing is one of the most fundamental human rights, because if you don't have housing, your other human rights go by the board. If you don't have housing, you're not going to eat properly. Your health is going to deteriorate. You're not going to be able to access education. You're not going to be able to access employment. So housing is one of the most fundamental human rights. Now, Fine Gael are totally opposed to putting this into the Constitution. It is in the programme for government, but Fine Gael have always insisted that they don't see the point. It's a waste of money. Spending money on a referendum doesn't build one single extra house. They're opposed to it, and their primary reason for opposing it is they don't want unelected judges telling the politicians what to do.
They've had a handy number, them and the other lads, for 100 years.
Yeah.
For 100 years, they've had the reins of this country, and they're shit scared of losing that power. That's the bottom line of it. And
well, if they're not providing the basic needs of people, then I think, yes, let's bring in the judges. Let's bring in the judges to tell them that they have to provide the basic needs of people.
And I reckon that I'm going to do a conservative estimate that there's 100,000 people on their arse in this country, right? If we add up all the people in hostels, hubs, homeless, just probably 200,000 people. And all we need is 200,000 people out on the streets, and it's game over. You know what I mean? We done it for water as a nation. All we had was 180,000 people at some of those marches, and we done it. And that's really all we need. And we're not far from it. And with the work that I do and the work that you do, highlighting the need for a referendum on housing, I think we can pull it off.
Yeah, but you won't get 180,000 people on the street in relation to housing, because the issue of housing doesn't affect so many people. The water charges were different. Everybody was impacted by the water charges. Not everybody is impacted by the lack of housing. And those who are impacted by the lack of housing, as you said earlier, are struggling from day to day. They don't have the energy to go out and start protesting. So we're not going to get those mass protests that we saw with the water charges. We have to find some other way to make their voices heard.
Yeah, I think we need to... I done this at Electric Picnic. David McWilliams was there, and he was talking to Donald Fallon in one of the podcast tents, and then Owen O'Brien and Donald were doing the next day. And so I robbed the mic at the end of it, and I got David and Owen to ask the audience, probably about 300 people each time, if there was a referendum on housing, would you vote for housing as a human right? And both of them, straight away, both of the audiences, all hands up. You know, one or two piss takers saying no. People don't deserve free houses. But it's not, as you said, it's not about free houses. So people are into it. And I think it's just about how do we frame it and phrase it, get the language right, and create something like the repeal movement around housing as a human right. Because more and more middle-class people are being squeezed.
That's right.
More and more. And I think that's where the key is. And that's what I was trying to do with Apollo House, was pluck the heartstrings of middle-class people to go, hold on a minute here. These are your brothers and sisters, like. It's not like it's them or that smelly homeless person. These are your brothers and sisters. And we captured the imagination of the country for about 3 weeks.
Yeah.
You know, and then it fell flat on its arse because we were challenging real power and real money in this country.
So what country was it a minute ago you mentioned that put a stop to all homelessness?
Finland.
Can other countries not take a leaf out of their books, as we call it, right?
Yeah, but you have to do what they did.
And try to, if they can make it work, surely enough other countries can come and do half of their work, half of what they can do, at least.
You need someone with a passion to drive it. As I say, three things came together. They built social housing on a large scale. The people who made the decisions stayed in their job for a long time. That doesn't happen here. And there was coordination between different state bodies. Getting state bodies to work together is extraordinarily difficult. Nobody wants their little comfort zone to be interfered with, so that they have to do things differently. So the addiction services work away, the mental health services work away. There's very little interaction between them. The housing, homeless services work away. Everybody's in their own silos doing their own thing. And that is not a recipe for solving this problem.
I'm going to put myself forward. I'm going to say I'm going to dedicate 3 days a week of my life for the next 15 years to eradicate homelessness in this country. Because that's what I was trying to do with Apollo House. Within 5 years was my plan, to eradicate street sleeping. And that isn't a big thing, because there's only 250, 300 street sleepers in this entire country. And I could end street sleeping in this country with €50 million. And if you think I can't, come and have a chat with me.
Everybody is aware of the empty buildings that are in every town, on every street. Certainly there is no reason why people should be homeless in provincial towns. There are more than enough empty buildings to house every homeless person in towns like Portlaoise and Carlow and Mullingar. Absolutely no reason why they should be homeless if we were serious about bringing back into use those empty homes. It's the same in Dublin, but it's a bit more complicated because the number of homeless people in Dublin is much, much greater. But we do have enough empty homes to be able to accommodate every homeless person. Even in Dublin we do. But we need someone who's going to drive this with a passion. We need some decision maker who will drive this with a passion if it's going to happen.
Instead of talking about building new homes, open up the old ones, the ones that's closed down.
Yep.
Because they're literally all around them then.
And it's much cheaper and much quicker.
Yeah.
When we're providing accommodation for homeless people, our priority, our preference is to renovate derelict buildings or to use derelict sites. And there's 3 advantages of that. It's cheaper and it's quicker than building from scratch. And thirdly, you get less opposition to housing homeless people because they see the community sees this derelict building, an eyesore and possibly a focus for antisocial behaviour. They see this derelict building or this derelict site being brought back into use, and they're actually delighted.
Yes.
So
I think we need a ballsy team. I think we need 5 or 6 people in a team with different experiences, with different, all passionate and all able to execute decisions like during the COVID, Austin, like Austin had, a team like that. Austin was on his own, but he managed to pull it off for a number of months with homelessness. But I think nationally, if you had a team that wasn't Dara, wasn't, in politics, that was like a separate team that were like czars for housing and homelessness. I think if you got a team like that together and you funded them and gave them the ability to make decisions, I think you could actually pull it off. But I don't think the ideological will is there. I just don't think the will is there whatsoever.
No, no minister is going to give up power and transfer it to another body. That's not going to happen. It did happen in the north of Ireland. There was a housing executive who made the decisions around housing. And the reason and that was non-political, the reason they did it was that they didn't trust either the unionists or the nationalist politicians not to gerrymander the housing issue if they were in charge of housing. So they gave it to a neutral body, the housing executive. They made the decisions and the politicians had no say over it.
I was just thinking about something you were saying earlier on there about when we talked about, say, Finland, basically, about how they worked and solved the problem. You were saying about certain persons staying in their jobs for longer because they knew how to deal with the situation, basically. They learned a lot about it, yeah. Well, that reminded me a little bit of Dublin City Council when they're dealing specifically with the travellers. I don't know what happens anywhere else, but we've noticed it anyway. For the past 15 or 16 years, we've been trying for, say, group housing where we live on that site. And there's 30 bays on the site. So we're looking for 30 as you call it, group housing, a scheme. It's like a scheme thing, yeah? So yes, they were promising to do them over and over and over and over. But the one thing that they were doing was to send in somebody to literally deal with us and get to know us and talk about the situation, get to understand what was going on in our area, basically, where we live. And then we'd have meetings, come to agreements, and we're nearly at the, let's say, at the edge of the mountain, if you like. Nearly had the deal sorted, like, right? And all of a sudden then we'd hear, such a person is moving to send somebody else in. And this was happening over and over and over. And the most we ever got out of one person to deal with the situation would have been about between a year and a half. So then that person was gone. Then they sent somebody else in. We'd have the same meetings over and over again. And then when we feel like we're getting progress again, they take that person away again, put them to a different office, and send another person out to do the exact thing. But it took us a long, long time to realise what was going on with them. And then, of course, there come also all sorts of excuses to push this thing back. So when the pressure then was rising, which we had a lot of strong meetings, a lot of talks about it, and when the pressure then was building up on this particular person to deliver, as we call it, they'd say, look, I'm going out here next week. Or before you'd even know it, someone else was in there. Right, what's the situation here now? I need to get to know this one. I need to get to know that one. I need to find out more about this. And we'll be explaining to them, look, Dublin City Council already know these things. They know the situation around here. They've known it for the past 15 or 16 years, even more. But that was strongly with our meetings, like, you know. So talking about people staying in their jobs for longer, getting to know the situation, and maybe do a good job on things. But no, that was the case. To get moving and moving and moving and moving along. So we were at square one all the time, even when we thought we were getting somewhere, without realising that we were still in square one the whole time.
Yeah, and it's very frustrating, and it makes people very angry.
There was a lot of anger. There was a lot of anger.
They poured honey in your ear, Martin, and you fell for it, you sucker.
Yeah, we fell for it over and over. There was a lot of anger.
Yeah.
A lot of anger with the residents on the site.
Of course there was.
Because they've been promised this and promised that. And again, as we told them, we weren't looking for mansions on the hill. We weren't looking for the champagne and caviar. We were just looking for basic living homes. And they had the space for them.
Meanwhile, right beside you, all steam ahead, €100 million super depot. Shut up, you thick traveller.
Basically, they used every excuse in the world so to push and push and push back. And all of a sudden, then we get slapped with these paperwork. We're building a super depot, which Dublin City Council owns, right on our doorstep. Yeah. But where they're building that now, we did talk about this before in the podcast, where they're actually building that, it was where, let's say, we grew up more or less. It was did you ever hear the 7 Pitches there in Ballymun?
Yeah.
That was them grounds. We all grew up there from like 8 years of age, like the best way of saying it. And we applied over and over and over because the site where we live was getting overpopulated by about, say, 30 families. Families grow up, traveller families, a lot of them has big families. And the years pass. Before you know, the grandkids are there, put it that way. Then the site was like, say, a population of maybe 50 families. So now we had young boys and girls growing up, living in the same bays as their parents because they had nowhere else to go. And we were having all these meetings about building bungalows and also building maybe a site or maybe more houses onto the land, the adjacent land, as you call it. And no, all of a sudden we get paperwork saying, look, we're building this super depot. Everything has been signed and passed. And it did cause a big uproar. Final say it didn't.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Because first of all, when the builders came onto the site, we all just got together and told them to go. With all due respect to the builders. It was the only way we knew how to deal with it. But there was no violence involved. We explained to these builders. And all of a sudden then Dublin City Council starts to notice us. And comes out, making phone calls, sending letters, asking for them to have meetings with them. So we did cooperate. We cooperated a lot, but being honest about it, we got nowhere for it. So we still done everything their way, and we're just right where we started up to this day. Now, the place where we're living, like it's been what? It opened up in 1997. So this particular site took us 25 years. Old, so it does need like renovating. When you have a lot of families on these sites, a lot of families growing up, a lot of kids. Of course, like deterioration takes place, doesn't it?
Basically, you have a landlord and you're in public housing on a site. You know what I mean? And next door, the landlord is building this big fancy depot, and you're looking at it going.
Are our landlords, but in one occasion, they took away one of them councillors, we called it, come on, and he took away say we had a caretaker, basically. We've had a caretaker on that site for the last, say, 42 years now, a little bit more. And that caretaker resigned. Never had a problem. He didn't have a problem with no one on the site. Didn't have a problem with him. He made himself home, well, let's say a home, if you like. So what happens was he retired then after up to about 10 years ago, if you like. New caretaker comes on. Same story, got to know all the people on the site. Well respected on both sides. And then one of these, as I said about these councilmen, the Dublin City Council, to send somebody in, he's there for so long, and he's gone again. He comes onto the site and takes the caretaker off it, takes up there was a couple of lads who come out once a week to do a bit of tidying, checking the maintenance stuff, takes them off it. For 18 months, no councilmen, no one from Dublin City Council, nobody literally on the site. We basically had to maintain the site ourselves and, let's say, keep the site afloat, if you like. And it didn't cost them a thought. But anyway, that was the moral of that story was where they don't keep people in the job long enough. They keep them for maybe a year or so, and they're gone. And they educate themselves on whatever they're dealing with. And again, a new person, same story, you think you're getting somewhere, and they take them out of there again. So I'm assuming it's probably happening all over Ireland.
So what they've done with you, Martin, is that like they have all the power and none of the responsibility. That it's their game. You're playing their game by their rules, and inevitably, it's like gambling. The house always wins. You know what I mean? That no matter what you do, once you're playing their games by their rules, they're always going to win. And what you've done, Peter, you've switched that up. You've started to create your own game and your own rules. And with the Peter McVerry Trust and Housing First, and you know that the system is against you, and it's rigged, and it's full of lads who have their own perspectives and priorities. But you're realising, when you realise over the last 30 years, we need to do this bleeding differently here.
Yeah, but we're only a drop in the ocean. We're not.
Absolutely.
We can't solve the housing crisis. We're only a drop in the ocean. But I think that drop is important. Plus, it gives us an understanding of the issue, which enables us to become radical and to become vocal about the changes that we see necessary. If we weren't running the organisation we're running, then we'd be like an outsider. We wouldn't have that first-hand experience of what the problems are and what the issues are and what the solutions could be. So, but we're only a drop in the ocean.
Peter, you don't mind asking one or two little questions, no?
Yeah, go on.
What encouraged you to become a priest? You were very young when you became a priest, is that right?
I joined the priesthood when I was 18. Why? I don't know, is the answer. My father was a doctor in Newry, a small little town at that stage. And when he started off, he didn't have an assistant or a partner to share the load with him. So he was on duty 24/7. I would often hear the phone going in the house at 2 o'clock in the morning. My father would get up and go out and see a patient. Never complained. So I think I got a sense of service from my father. My mother was a Welsh Protestant who converted to Catholicism in order to marry my father, because in those days, if a Catholic married a Protestant, they were destined to go to hell for all eternity.
Happy days.
So to avoid that fate, my mother became a Catholic, and like many converts, became more Catholic than the Catholics themselves.
Love was powerful.
So we had Mass on Sunday, of course, family rosary every night. So I think I got a sense of service from my father and a sense of faith from my mother. And when I was deciding what to do with my life, I think what happened was those two things came together. I wanted to be of service in a faith context, and becoming a priest was, in those days, an obvious way to do that. So I said, well, I'll give it a try and see what happens. Gave it a try, never looked back. I'd do the same all over again.
And you're getting younger looking as well, Peter.
Well, I'm not so sure that I don't think I feel younger.
I started off in a similar thing because I was like an altar boy in Ballymun, whatever age you're an altar boy at, 11, 12, and I loved it. I adored it. And in the community here when I was growing up, so that would have been, I was born in 73, that would have been like 82, 83, 84, going to church and listen to the priest and listen to the gospels and all that was just opened my heart, you know. And loads of my mates were altar boys. And then things changed. 85, 86, 87, a few things changed in this community. You know, they closed down the mental health institutions. They invited people from those institutions into Ballymun. Heroin was introduced into Dublin, and things started to change very quickly. And my kind of young, idealistic way of looking at the world and becoming an altar boy and a priest kind of changed very quickly. So what I do is, it's very similar to what you do, but it's in my own community. I see it exactly the same way. It's a service.
Yeah.
So, Peter, at 18 years of age, you became a priest at 18.
Well, I joined the Jesuits at 18. I didn't become a priest until 1975.
So you had to study from there, is it? Yeah.
Yeah, you had a lot of study. And
12 years, is it?
It varies from person to person.
Yeah.
I did a noviceship 2 years. Then I went to college. I went to UCD. I studied science, chemistry and maths for 4 years. And I taught chemistry and maths in one of our schools for 2 years.
Very good.
And then I studied for another 5 or 6 years philosophy and theology. Then I got ordained as a priest.
Brilliant. So the other question I want to ask you as well, yeah, this is not interrogation now, it's only a chat.
All right.
What encouraged you to become involved with homelessness? That was a big step.
That happened by accident.
Yeah?
I was in the inner city of Dublin, as I say, living in the tenement buildings there. And the unemployment, apart from the lousy housing, the unemployment rate was about 80%, because inner city people worked on the docks beside them, loading and unloading ships. And then when containerization came in and the cranes did it all, they lost their jobs. So a young person growing up in the inner city, often living in those appalling conditions, no hope of ever, no expectation of ever getting a job.
No.
So what was they said to themselves, what's the point in staying on in school if you're not going to get a job? So the issue that hit us, first of all, was young people leaving school early. Many of them were leaving school at the latest by the age of 12. They were hanging around the streets all day long. Many of their parents were unemployed, couldn't afford to give them money. So what were they doing? A little bit of robbing. And by the time they got to 16 and 17, they were doing an awful lot of robbing and going to prison. So that was the issue. So we opened a youth club for the kids in the area. We opened a craft centre. They could make lovely crafts, and we were able to.
When you say we, basically, did you take this upon yourself?
Well, there were 3 of us living there, but I was the one who was running
3
this.
priests.
Jesuit priests.
Yeah, very good, yes.
Yeah, but I was the one who was running the service, as it were.
Yes, you were taking control of the situation.
The others had work elsewhere, outside of the inner city. So we opened a craft centre, and we were able to employ some of the young people who were making the crafts, and we'd sell them to the shops in town to pay their wages.
Brilliant.
So I did that for a few years, and then I came across a kid sleeping on the street, 9 years of age. So we said, look, we have a youth club, we have a craft centre, we have employment schemes, let's get a house and open a little hostel. So we did. We got a house. We opened a hostel for 6 boys up to the age of 16.
Lovely.
Why boys? There were no girls in the streets back in the 70s. That only came later. So I had the hostel, said I'll run this for a couple of years, then I'll go off and do something else. And the young people were leaving the hostel at 16 and a half, and they were going back on the streets because there was nothing for them. So we opened, I was living in Ballymun then because they demolished the inner city. So I asked Dublin City Council for a flat to use as a hostel for the over 16s. So to my surprise and to their regret ever since, they gave me a 3-bedroom flat, and we started using that as a hostel for the older age group. The numbers grew and grew. We often had 14, 15 young people sleeping in a 3-bedroom flat. So we had to get another house to take the overflow. And the drug problem came. 14, 15-year-olds injecting heroin. So we had to open a detox centre. Then we had to open a drug-free house for those who had finished the detox. And the Child Care Act came in and we had to separate out the under-18s from the over-18s, so we had to open another hostel. So it just went on like that. There was no big plan. We just went from year to year for many years. Then about 15 years ago, I was getting old. I was running everything. So we decided, look, we have to make this organisation independent of myself. Otherwise, if I died, fell under a bus, the whole thing would collapse. So we brought in a CEO, Pat Doyle, who's absolutely fantastic. And he brought in an admin team. And he has expanded the organisation enormously.
Very good.
Way beyond anything I could do. And at that time, the bureaucratic demands were increasing. The reports that you had to provide, the accountability was
the governance,
was
all that type of stuff,
all that sort of thing. And I had no interest in that. I had no interest in sitting down and writing strategic plans or policies and procedures. But he does that and does it extremely effectively. So from that 9-year-old kid sleeping on the street, we now have 25 hostels all over Dublin and Kildare.
God.
Almost 1,000 homeless people in the hostels every night. We have about between 500 and 600 apartments where we can give a homeless person key of the door and say, this is yours for the rest of your life. You never ever have to be homeless again.
Brilliant.
We have 6 alcohol and drug treatment services, 4 residential 2-day programs. We have a lovely drop-in centre in Dublin. And we actually run 2 small schools.
Come on, will you?
So
We
look
do.
at
Will you?
brilliant.
We have 2 small schools
So
for
do
kids who have been expelled from mainstream education or who have dropped out. About 40 kids between the 2 schools. The reason for that is that many of the homeless people we deal with have left school early. It's one of the characteristics. So we're hoping that by keeping these kids in school, we can prevent some of them becoming homeless adults in the future. The schools are remarkably successful. 95% of the kids stay on in school right up to their junior cert.
Wow.
And then we help them either back into mainstream education to do their leaving cert or into an apprenticeship or into youth reach.
So it's
So
massive.
all that has developed out of, by accident in a way, by one kid sleeping on the street.
Well, by the grace of God also.
Yeah.
Do we call you St. Peter from now on, or what do we do?
That's what I was thinking earlier on, because
people call
inevitably, Peter,
I
right,
think
and
you
you
deserve-
mentioned
I
yourself, you
think
will
you-
pass away, right?
I think you deserve that title at
I
least.
think we'll give you that one.
Huh?
I've been called a lot worse.
St. Peter.
Here, I was
there
thinking,
somewhere.
I just talk to people about housing and homelessness and what perpetuates it and all this. And I would have said out loud before, sure, all the organisations like Focus and the Paul and Peter's Place, they're keeping the homeless thing going because they've got so many bleeding staff now working for them that it's in their interest to keep it going. Now, I know that that's naive. And I know that eventually what you're trying to do is create this model or this asset where we can eliminate, homelessness. But there is an awful lot of staff that you pay that if homelessness ended tomorrow could
Yep.
potentially be out.
Some of them. Well, we have 500 full-time staff.
Wow.
But we have told the government we will not open any more hostels. Hostels are not a solution to homelessness.
No.
Hostels get people off the streets, and that's important.
Yes.
But our business now is providing homes for homeless people. And so we will expand the number of apartments and houses that we have every year. We'll add maybe 200, 250 every year to our stock of apartments and houses and give homeless people a key of the door for life.
Key and a
So-
contract. There you go. Get in.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's our focus. That's our priority. So we're in the business of eliminating homelessness. We'd love to close the hostels in the morning if we had enough apartments to house everybody in.
So do we need more Father Peter McVerrys in the government office or what?
We need government policy to change.
We could do
And
a
I think it
referendum
is
as well.
slowly changing. If the government realise that this housing crisis could potentially throw them out of a job at the next election.
Yeah.
Is that taking the bleeding long enough to realise that?
Yeah, but they do realise.
When
it.
is the next election, Peter?
Well, it's not till 2025, or is it 2024? No, 2025, I think. So Micheál Martin had 2.5 years, and Leo Varadkar will have 2.5 years as Taoiseach, so that's 23, 24, 2025.
Is that coalition? Because I remember when I was doing Apollo House, and then there was the election after it, and the number one thing on the agenda was housing and homelessness. And hopefully I had a little bit to play in that and raising the awareness of the country, which forced Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael to get into bed together, which opened the possible pathway for Sinn Féin or someone else to come in, because the two parties had the reins for 100 years and have almost, from our perspective, driven into the wall. And I think that's where we're at the moment. And the work that you're doing to highlight this, and possibly a referendum and all that type of stuff, is going to be great. But I think it's just like Dublin City Council pouring honey in Martin's ear. If we don't have a change of ideology, we're going to be just, using sticky plasters for the next 10 years.
There is a slow change in ideology. We're not a lot like England. I mean, Liz Truss now in England is the arch neoliberal ideology.
She's just like privatize everything.
Privatize everything, deregulate everything, lower taxes. That is standard neoliberal ideology, and it's going to run England into the ground, actually.
So just for people...
We're not in that situation. I think we are far more compassionate, and our politicians are far more compassionate than we see sometimes in England or in America.
So for people listening in, we've said neoliberal a couple of times. Basically what that means is kind of relaxed regulations around private businesses making profit. It's a liberal way of looking at business. We don't have as many rules and regulations that tie profiteers up. They're free to make as much money as they want.
Yeah, neoliberals want to reduce government action, reduce government spending, and increase private sector. And on the basis the private sector can do things better and cheaper and more efficiently than the public sector. That's the basis of that ideology, and there's some truth in that. You see what the government runs things, make a mess of it. But ultimately, for basic needs, for people's basic needs like housing and health and education, the state must take responsibility. Now, even if they delegate it to the private sector, as they're doing with housing, they're delegating housing to the organisations like ourselves. Even where they do delegate, because we can run services much better than the state can, even where they do delegate services to groups like us, they must retain responsibility for funding and for standards. They cannot just abdicate the responsibility. So, and that's
so your call is that an approved housing body? Is that where you are?
Yeah.
And I know next week you're doing a cycle into
Wexford,
140k, and you're using that. Is that your main fundraiser this year?
It's the biggest single fundraiser.
Okay.
Now we have a lot of fundraising going on.
Yeah.
We have a budget this year of 50 million.
50 million.
We'll get 38 million roughly from the government, and we'll have to fundraise another 12 million. So the Wexford Cycle is our single biggest fundraiser, but we have fundraisers going on all year round to try and reach that target.
And does any of your funding come from like the Atlantic philanthropist types, those types of lads, those Irish who went off to the States and made billions?
Yeah, not really. There are companies that support us. That dropped during COVID, obviously, because businesses went into a decline. But we do have companies that support us, and they're very important to us. But we don't have any big philanthropists.
So let's say 50 million. Let's say that through the power of this podcast, I reach out to a couple of heads, because I know some of those Atlantic philanthropists. Chuck Feeney put the money on the table for Young Ballymun. I know lads who run Google.org, the giving arm of Google, and so on. So let's say through the magic of this podcast and my brass balls, we doubled your funding, and this year you had 100 million quid. What do you do with it?
We build, buy, or lease apartments. That's where we're going. It's providing apartments and houses for homeless people.
And you grow
anything
that asset.
Anything like that, we will invest in house building or house renovation, bringing houses back into use. That's where the bulk of our money does go at the moment. apart from the running costs. The running costs, obviously, of hostels and that are pretty expensive, but whatever capital money we get goes into buildings.
That's not just fantasy. Like when we done Apollo House, we got a phone call saying, there's 15 million quid here. Do you want it to take that building over? You know what I mean? So there are lads out there with a lot of money, and reaching out to them is something that is possible. And they do want Irish society to become that thing that we're looking to have, where we're a bit more charitable and compassionate, and we're helping people, putting a hand out to help people out of the gutter and so on. But I just think we need to ask for it. We need to say it. We need to sit down with those lads in LA with all that money and go, here's the plan for the next 10 years.
And I think we need to apologise for asking, because the state should be doing this.
Absolutely, 100%.
Homeless people should not depend on some rich guy providing money to house them. Homeless people shouldn't depend on, communities running coffee mornings to try and raise the money to house homeless people. They shouldn't have to do that. The state should do it. So when I'm asking for money, I often apologise. Say, look, you shouldn't be giving us money. And I shouldn't be asking you for money, but we're not getting enough from the state, and therefore we have to ask you. But I'm sorry, it's not your responsibility. It's the state's responsibility to provide housing for homeless people.
Phrase goes, if you don't ask, you won't get.
That's true.
I've no problem asking. I will ask.
I have no problem asking, but always conscious that
you shouldn't have to ask.
Yeah, and like have a bit of humility.
Have you ever thought, Peter, when say going back years now, when all this started and you're saying about the 8-year-old boy in the street, have you ever thought, like, say maybe a few years later, that like, what did I get myself into here? Like, is it too much for me, or is it too much pressure and stuff like that?
As it grew,
probably no support at the time either. Like,
as it grew, it was. It was very tempting to stop and walk away.
It was scratched the head like a tin
It was getting
cheese.
bigger and bigger and bigger, and I was saying, can I cope with this? Can I manage this?
Yes.
But you just went from year to year, see what needed to be done. And you built relationships with homeless people. And you can't just walk away. You have close relationships with some homeless people.
Yeah.
And you can't just say, look, I'm sorry, I've had enough now, I'm off. You can't do that to people.
It's like
so you keep going even when they're going.
It's like a situation where there's no turn back. Like,
yeah.
You can do it, just that you don't. People do it.
Well, yeah.
It is part of the human condition to make temporary relationships with people for your own benefit and then walk away. I think what you've realised is that there's a benefit for us all if I maintain these open, honest relationships. And that's what you call service,
It's all about relationships in the end of the day. I mean, what do homeless people want most of all? It's not money. It's not even a place to live. What they want most of all is respect. They want respect, and they want to know that somebody cares.
Cares about them, yes.
That's what homeless people want most of all, and the rest can follow. But if that isn't there, the rest is only dressing.
Yeah, dignity and respect.
Yeah.
And I remember a lot of the stuff is coming back to me now just when you say words like that, they want respect. I remember being in Apollo House on the first night and being in a room with 40 homeless people, and I sat in a corner with a couple of girls, and we laughed and cried about all the shit that they've been through. And in the next room, 3 young men slept on one mattress, and I could hear them snoring. And in the morning they woke up and they went and had a shower, and they came in and they were nearly crying their eyes out, going, we feel like we're at home here. Yeah.
Like a new lease of life for them.
We feel respected. Yeah. We don't feel like yous are looking down on us, or we're the charity cases. Yous are the helpers and we're the helped. You know what I mean? We feel human today for the first time in a long fucking time.
Yeah.
So you basically, Peter, gave your life to the homeless in a sense.
Well, looking back on it, that's what's happened.
Yes,
there was never any conscious decision.
Did you ever think it was going to get so big? Like,
I never thought it would get.
I never imagined that, did you?
If I'd known it was going to get this big, I'd have run a mile.
No. And there's something at the bottom of it all, whether it's, I don't know, community or the common good or love or your faith, that it's not just about this world that we're in here now, that there is something eternal beyond all of this. you know, which is possibly at the bottom of all of your faith, is that we all came from somewhere, we're here for 70, 80 years, and we return to something.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I believe in God. My image of God has changed from working with homeless people. I grew up believing God was a judge and had laid down all these laws and rules, and your relationship with God depended on how well you obeyed them or how well you didn't obey them. And then a young kid said to me, you know, the very thought there might be a God depresses me. I was trying to figure out what he meant. I'm used to young people telling me they don't believe in God. But this was going one step further. I came to realize what he was trying to say. He believed he was a bad person. He had broken every commandment in the book, and he had broken every law, and he'd been to prison multiple times. He just felt he was a bad person. And so he felt, if there's a God up there looking down on me, God is saying, there's a bad person. There's someone I couldn't possibly love. And if he died and he went went before God, he would imagine God saying to him, get away from me. I don't want anything to do with you, you bad person. Now, I knew that kid, and he grew up in what I call a disaster home, where there was a lot of violence, a lot of abuse, and a huge amount of neglect. And I am saying to myself, if there is a God, this young person must have a special place in God's heart because of what he has suffered as a child. And if he went to meet God, God must have a great big welcome for him because of what he has suffered. And so I became conscious, or my understanding of God developed. God is compassion, and God is the one who cares about us and who cares about all our everything to do with our lives. God is concerned about every minute of our lives and what we are going through. And so for me, each of us, each human being is there to show that care. That, you know, if somebody is homeless, God isn't going to wave a magic wand and get them out of homelessness. No, that's what we're there for. It's up to us to reach out to people who are suffering, to reach out to people who are in difficulties, to reach out to people who are lonely. And in our reaching out, that's God reaching out to them. But that's what I see now as my purpose in life, here to make life a little bit better, a little bit more hopeful for some other people. And if you can do that even for one person, that makes your life worthwhile.
Buddhists say reduce suffering in the world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
God is love.
God is love. Love and compassion.
We've heard this numerous times in the church where he says, look, you are my eyes, you are my words, you are my hands and my legs. And he gives us the guidance to do what's obviously right.
No, God comes to us.
We make that good
God
decisions.
comes to us in disguise. As a Christian, I believe that this little child, born in a stable, poor, homeless, vulnerable little child, was the presence of God to us. And as a Christian, I believe that this man, a criminal hanging on the cross, was the presence of God to us. And so, and in the Gospels, it's very clear that the poor, the hungry, the thirsty, the naked, the prisoner, the stranger, they're all God present to us. And so in reaching out to them, we reach out to God. We encounter God in our reaching out to them. And if we fail to reach out to them, we fail to encounter God. So for me, my faith is, God exists in other people, and it's in the relationship we build with other people that we encounter God. And particularly, I mean, every parent, what they want most of all is that their children would grow up to be happy and fulfilled adults. That's what they want. Now, each human being is a child of God, and God wants exactly the same. God wants every human being to grow up into a happy and a fulfilled person. And it's all of our jobs to make that happen, to reach out and to make that happen. So, for me, service of others is at the heart of my understanding of God. Without service to others, I don't know what God would mean to me.
So there's two interesting things there. One is that it sounds like you're saying these people are presented to us as an opportunity for us to realise that's God showing his hand here.
That's right.
Going, get in here, get stuck in, fall in love with me, help me to get to where we all know we should be, and we'll do that together and we'll both grow. So in some way, the other thing that came to my head was that there's grace, what I call grace, which is the presence of God in that suffering, you know? And sometimes we look at suffering going, I don't want any more of that suffering. But actually hidden in it, in the matrix, in the code behind it is, here's an opportunity for you to grow your heart, to be more compassionate, to come closer to what you call God, what I call love.
Yeah, those who are in need, those who are hungry, thirsty, naked, those who are lonely, those who are refugees, everybody who is in need offers us the greatest gift that anyone can offer us. They invite us to open our hearts to include them in our love. And if we open our hearts to include them in our love, then we become more loving persons. And therefore we become more like God. And no one can offer us the gift of becoming, and no one can offer us a greater gift than the gift of becoming more like God. But if we refuse to open our hearts to them, then we refuse their invitation to grow in love. And therefore we show ourselves to be not yet ready to enter into the kingdom of God.
So what are you saying is, it's not the €1 million, it's not the yacht, it's not the beautiful sexy woman, it's not the Ferrari, it's not the 14-bedroom house up in Bleeding Hout. Are you saying that these other things, the homeless man, the naked, tired person, you're saying that that's where it is?
Yeah, they're more important.
That's where God is. That's where God is to be found.
So I'm going to give me yacht back.
The big sin of our world today is the indifference of privileged people towards those who are suffering. They can pass them by, they can see them, but it's the indifference. It's the blindness, the closed eyes that doesn't see the pain and the suffering, and doesn't want to see the pain and the suffering because that would involve doing something about it. It's that indifference is the big sin of our world today.
I remember Pope John Paul, this is getting very Catholic-y and all that, and I know, not everyone has the same relationship you or Martin might have with the Catholic Church, especially in Ireland, especially growing up in the 70s and 80s. But I remember I was like 6 when Pope John Paul came here in 1979. I had the flu and I couldn't go. But I remember being inspired by what he says, going, the big sins here is consumerism. And it's kind of similar to, you can have the watch and the house and the fancy clothes, and that's where your value is, and disregards your community, disregards your family. Just be a standalone man with your own millions, and you'll be sorted.
Yeah, I remember when Pope John Paul came as well. We were running a hostel for those kids up to the age of 16. We decided we'd go to Galway for the youth mass. So we got them up about 4 o'clock in the morning, got into the minibus. We had a great time on the trip down to Galway. And we got into position. As soon as the Pope came, kids all fell asleep. And after he was gone, they woke up and they had a great time on the bus on the way back.
And that's where it is. That's where it is, because it's like the parent going, I can't meditate, these kids are wrecking me head. Well, be with your kids.
Yeah.
That's where that God is, or that peace that you're looking for. Yeah. It's not in you going off and just doing the service to yourself. And, it's in the people around you. It's right in front of you. If you could just open your eyes and change your perspective, it's right there in front of you. The Pope came through Ballymun the last time he was here. There's a great photograph. Two lads standing outside the Towers pub, thumbs up like that to the Pope, and the Pope's like that out the window. I'm going to stick it up on our Instagram, actually. Brilliant. It's a cracker of a photograph.
Yeah.
Because the Pope knows where the realness is. It's in Ballymun.
Yeah, when Pope John Paul came, he went through Sean McDermott Street. And they painted, Dublin City Council painted Liberty House, which faces Sean McDermott Street. But they only painted the two sides that the Pope would see.
Yes.
which was first of all a slap in the face to the local residents. You're not important enough to paint the whole place. Anyway, the Pope came down, Sean McDermott. He was meant to stop off in the church in Sean McDermott Street and meet some of the local people, but he was running late. He had a meeting with the politicians up in Dublin Castle or somewhere, and so he didn't stop. And it was really, inner city people felt really let down.
Disappointed.
You would have
badly.
had to turn up to that Magdalene laundry, and then the beans would have been spilled. Then you know what I mean. If he knew where he was, because Sean McDermott Street in an Irish context is an interesting place. Magdalene laundries and all that type of stuff.
He was a great pope, though, wasn't he, Pope John Paul?
He was what?
He was a great pope, wasn't he?
He was in some ways. In other ways, he had his faults.
Yeah.
Like yourself, Peter.
We all have.
I like the idea of I have a cramp in my leg.
He's
I'm
a
had to
saint,
do a
isn't he?
70k cycle and my legs are cramping up. I'm going to leave this in. I'm sure the Pope, like the Queen, God rest her, everywhere they went there was a smell of bleeding fresh paint. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
One side of the street painted.
Good cartoon of Liz Truss meeting the Queen the day before she died. And Liz Truss was saying to the Queen, I don't think you're going to last very long. And the Queen replied back, I don't think you are either.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know too much about it. I'd be interested in seeing where they go as a country now that their lead monarch has passed. That
Yeah.
King Charles sounds like a bleeding dog to me, to be honest.
Well, Queen Elizabeth had the affection of the whole nation. She was quite an extraordinary person. Charles doesn't have the same impact on people. They don't have the same affection for him as they. So I'm not sure. I think the monarchy could start to dissolve.
Yeah, and with like the stuff around Philip and all that type of stuff, I think it's an interesting point in their history. And just like Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, they've had long enough.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Maybe it's time that we have a different setup in this country and in that country, and throw the dice in a different direction and see, can we get closer to compassion and community and charity again?
Do you know many travellers, Peter?
I wouldn't say I knew many. I've encountered many, all right.
Good or bad?
I know, very good.
Yeah.
Very good. I mean, a lot of number of traveller organisations have asked me to talk at things that they were organising.
Very good.
Any of the travellers that I have encountered have been great. I think that's important, that get out the stories. We need to get out the stories of travellers who have succeeded very well, and homeless people we need to change that perception.
Yeah.
So we need to highlight travellers who have become social workers and teachers and
Senators,
community organisers and we need to highlight that. And many homeless people have done very well for themselves. I'm constantly getting people coming up to me on the street saying, I was in your hostel 15 years ago, did me the world of good. Now I have a lovely job, I have a lovely home, I have a family. I'm doing absolutely great.
Well, our first guest on here is someone who's been through that, which is Shawnee Kinsley, who's now like leading out this cycle that you're doing next week.
Yeah.
And he's running his own business, doing kind of PT work. Like, he's a phenomenal success if you look at, the paths through homelessness, poverty and addiction and so on. And that chap is just full of love now.
Yeah.
He's living proof of recovery, isn't he?
So a lot of people have very negative attitudes towards travellers, towards homeless people, and we need to change that perception.
And it's just perspective.
It is.
You know what I mean?
Perspective.
Just perspective. Where are you standing?
Because their only encounter with travellers or homeless people is in the crime pages of the local newspaper, where a traveller or a homeless person is causing havoc. They don't see the positive side of travellers, the positivity in travellers, the travellers who are really a model for the travelling community and for everybody
they
else.
see the comic effect of The Criminal, like that film Snatch with Brad Pitt. They see the comic effect. They don't see. We don't build travellers up. We don't big up homeless people because it doesn't suit a specific narrative in this country on radio or in press or on RTE or whatever like that. And through things like this podcast, all I'm trying to do is shift the perspective. a little bit, you know. And if people, and it is happening, because I know people in my own family and own friends have said to me, wow, I never seen travellers in that light.
Yeah.
It's amazing, the humility and the compassion and the community sense that they have.
Yeah, Roddy Doyle did a film on homelessness called Rosie. And what he did was he followed a family who became homeless.
That's right.
It's absolutely fantastic. I thought when I saw it first, it was a documentary. It was
Yeah.
so real. But it was your heart would be moved by this family and what they had to go through. And Roddy deliberately, the family didn't drink, didn't smoke. He wanted to avoid anybody being able to say, well, it's their own fault.
Big holes in it. Yeah.
But it was absolutely fantastic. And the family was so real, and your heart would go out to them, what they had to go through.
Was
And
that the name of the
efforts they
film,
made.
Rosie?
Huh?
Was that the name of the film or the actor, Rosie?
No, Rosie was the name of the film, yeah.
So, and so what, Peter? What benefit did that bring to any homeless people in this country?
Well, I'm sure it changed some people's attitudes.
Some people's attitude, yeah.
And that's
yeah.
all you can do. You
Yeah,
keep
just
chip-
like
you
you're
get chip-
saying, you're doing a drop in the ocean. What we need is across the board
you just chip
perspective
away.
change.
You just chip away at people's
Yeah,
attitudes.
and don't feel so disheartened if you don't. Like for me, not achieving the end of street sleeping in Dublin in 5 years, probably 4 years ago would have killed me. But now I kind of, I'm all right with it.
Yeah.
I'm not so attached to the outcome. I'm all right just doing the process of going out every day and doing my bit.
Yeah.
Because I was in a very, very dark place maybe 3 or 4 years ago, where the weight of the world is on your shoulders and you think it's unfair and I'm right and everyone else is wrong. And sometimes you are right, but there's also just the world and just humans and how we interact with each other, and human nature.
The chances are some things are never going to change anyway. Let it be for travellers or homelessness or whatever the downfalls are.
I think things do change.
Well, some things change, but
When
a
I
lot
started,
doesn't.
when I started, we were working with homeless teenagers who were on the street, 14, 15-year-olds who were running away from home, running away from the children's institutions. And the attitude to them was very negative. And when we opened our hostel, I went to the health board and I said, we're going to open this. Will you help us? Will you fund it? They said, no way. They believed these runaway kids were little brats, and their solution to the kids running away was call the Gardaí, pick them up, bring them back home again. And they saw me as part of the problem, not part of the solution, because here I was giving these kids a place to live, feeding them properly, buying them clothes, bringing them on holidays. And
You're treating those little shits
the attitude was,
amazingly.
sure, why wouldn't everybody run away from home?
Yeah.
If you're going to treat them like that. Now, and so they didn't want to do anything. And those kids on the streets were ignored and rejected by the state effectively. Now we have the Childcare Act. Now those kids are well looked after. You won't find an under 18-year-old sleeping rough. And not for more than a couple of nights. They'll be picked up straight away. They'll be brought to a children's home which is of the highest standards of care and protection for these children. Things have totally changed for these homeless 14 and 15-year-olds.
Is that because you do this?
In part.
I think possibly in part, but I think people
So if you weren't
became-
doing any of this, would there have been changes?
I
No.
think it would have changed, yeah.
Who would
People became
have
more
done it
aware.
if not for you?
People became more aware of the abuse that was happening in homes, the violence that some of these children experienced.
Yeah.
There was one case where there was a court case where a father was convicted of the most horrific physical and sexual abuse of his daughter. And that court case was finished on a Friday, and everybody was reading about it. Everybody was horrified by it. A social worker rang me up on the Friday and said, that girl is living on the street. She said, I can't say anything because I'd lose my job.
Mm-hmm.
What will you? So I went public, and it was major news for about a week that this girl who had suffered so much was being ignored by the state. The Minister for Health was on the television promising this could never happen again, promising they would reach out to this girl, they would ensure that she was well looked after. So I think the general realization of the of the horrors that were taking place in some family homes led to a sympathy for these kids and an understanding, no, they shouldn't be at home. We should be looking after them properly. So
yeah, and things change. We had British rule here for a couple of 100 years. We had industrial schools. We had Magdalen laundries. They're all gone. We have we have same-sex marriage in now. We have the smoking ban. Things change.
Yeah.
I think for me, what's next on the table, which a part of it is ending street sleeping or rough sleeping in this state in Ireland. The other one is that we start to build a relationship with the travelling community beyond the K word, and that we see them not only as Irish citizens but as human. And things will change.
Is it enough to make just to make change, or does there have to be a full stop put to all these things?
What do you mean?
We still have homeless on the streets, am I right? We still have poverty throughout Ireland.
Yep.
We still have, again, if you want to talk about travellers, I'm not talking about travellers here, I know it's a different thing we're talking about, but it's part of it. Travellers are still being discriminated against.
Yep.
They're still being, let's say, looked down upon. A lot of travellers, not every traveller, a lot. As I said before on this podcast, it's not just travellers. A lot of travellers are living in poverty, but also a lot of the settled community are living in poverty too. Yep. So, yeah, there is change, but is this small? I'm not concerning yourself, Peter, because we all know you're a legend in what you do. Is this change enough, or is it? Or do we need a full stop to all of this?
Well, change in action only comes after a change in attitude. And we have to change people's attitudes.
Yes, that's right.
We have to change people's awareness. And only when that changes sufficiently will that result in a change in action. So it's about making people more aware. It's about highlighting the wonderful stories of travellers, the wonderful stories of homeless people, and what they have achieved. It's about changing people's attitudes, and only then will we see change.
And how do we do that? One way we do it is by podcast. The other way is campaigning. The other way is lobbying. The other way is art. Like Brendan Behan wrote a play about Mountjoy Prison, which ended hanging in Ireland. You know what I mean? But he had to do it through art. It was a bitter pill to swallow, because we were going, no, just hang them. They done A, B, and C. Just hang them. It was a bitter pill to swallow, and he made art about it.
Yeah. People have different skills. Artists, writers, broadcasters, all have a part to play in changing attitudes.
Peter, pleasure having you in. It was great chatting.
Pleasure having you, Hank.
I didn't go too scripted, because I just wanted to freeball it, because I think that's just much more interesting, because you've done loads of these. You're probably the most interviewed priest in the world, you could talk the head off a hammer, but I wanted to just let it go, let it flow, and see where we come with. And for me, it's come with, service, action, love, compassion. It's beautiful. Thank you very much.
I'm sure you obviously feel great about your achievement. And again, by the grace of God. My achievement,
when I started working with homeless people, there were about 1,000 homeless people in Ireland.
It's 10,500.
Now there's 10,500, so it's not much of an achievement. I feel a little bit like our CEO, Pat Doyle. CEO Pat Doyle was walking along one day with his little 7-year-old child, and they saw a guy begging. And his child said to Pat, what's that man doing there? And Pat said, he's homeless. And his child looked at Pat and he said, you work with homeless people, don't you? Pat said, yes. His son said, you're not doing a very good job, are you? And that's a bit how you feel, where homelessness is rising and rising and rising.
It can get a bit demoralising and heartbreaking, but if you get attached to the outcome, I think that can knock you. We just continue to do what we're doing. We do it with an open, honest heart. And let's just reach out to more people. And I'm saying this again, I'm going to reiterate this. Lads, yous have billions out there. Come and have a chat with me and Peter, and let's, as Martin's saying, let's draw a line underneath this shit. It's 2022, 2023, 2024. What's the number? How long do we have to be established as a republic in order for us to cherish each child and give them, enshrined in the Constitution, the right to a home?
And also let them not forget, if it wasn't for St. Peter McVerry, things would be probably 100 times worse.
Money is part of the solution,
Yeah.
but it's only part of the solution.
Absolutely.
Homelessness is a political problem. It has to be solved politically. One way, as I say, we've been talking about getting the right to housing into the Constitution.
Yeah.
The other thing is during COVID, the number of homeless people dropped by about 2,000. How did that happen? Because there was a ban on evictions from the private rented sector. We are calling for that ban to be extended now for the next 2 or 3 years. When that ban was lifted about 9 months ago, the number of homeless people is going up and up and up and has now reached record levels. So the solution to homelessness is a political problem. It does involve money, but money on its own will not solve homelessness.
So right to housing in the Constitution, a ban on evictions, anything else that screams out at you? Build more public houses.
Well, that's the key, is to build more social housing. That is the key to the solution. There are other things, the mortgage to rent scheme. We need to keep people in their homes. If a landlord, if a person can't pay the mortgage, we need to put them onto the mortgage to rent scheme, which means they stay in the home and they rent it from the local authority or a housing body like ourselves. That scheme exists, but it needs to be expanded. There's a lot of limitations to it. The other thing is we need to, if a landlord wants to sell a house, the local authority should be offered first choice to buy it. And the local authority could, if they agree and it's reasonable to buy the house, the tenant stays in the house, doesn't have to be evicted, and the landlord gets the market value for the house. A win-win for everybody.
A mate of mine was in a house. He bought it at the absolutely pinnacle time in the market when the prices were ridiculous. Had a family, had a couple of kids, was in precarious employment, couldn't repay the mortgage, was suicidal, was almost about to take his own life, and then realised that the approved housing bodies were there. They took control of the house, and now he rents off them.
Yeah.
And it's super. And now he's happy. His family is thriving. His kids are going to school. Win, win, win across the board.
And there's thousands of people in mortgage arrears which they will never ever be able to meet, and all of those should be offered the mortgage to rent scheme.
It's a pleasure talking to you and a pleasure listening to you. And thanks very much for coming onto our podcast. And I find you a very, very humble person.
My pleasure being here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Great.
God bless.
Sorry, last one. Exchange House, Pavey Point, Irish Traveller Movement, FLAC, anybody else, promote this podcast. Travellers are listening to it. They're being empowered and informed. And that's how we change the lot of the traveller in Ireland. Peter, episode 16. Traveller and a Countryman.
God bless.
So that's us for this episode, a Traveller and a Countryman podcast. If you like it, let us know, share it around, and we'll see you on the road.